Hey, Thea, thank you for coming in. Just really a marvelous background. I mean, you know, you get this sort of themes of law and business and governance and ethics and youth, peace building and leadership, and competitive figure skating, and I mean, just doing so much. And you're under 30. You're just in your roughly around the mid 20s. So that's pretty amazing. All of the accomplishments you've been able to do so far. I can imagine where you'll be in the few years to come. Perhaps the first or second Prime Minister of Canada. I mean, your career has that kind of arc, right? Where or me perhaps being a governor general if you were wanted to go in that route, or it could be in some other area. But really, it's just one is just absolute tremendous accomplishment. But I know that comes with grit and hard work and agility and things like that. So Thea, thank you for coming in and sharing your experiences with our audience.
Thank you. You're making me blush. Really appreciate all those compliments and thank you for having me. You are in itself also a very impressive person, so appreciate you taking the time.
Yeah, so what I'm going to do is we've already done an interview with you quite a few years ago now. And I'm just going to kind of summarize some of the things I learned from that interview. And then what I'll do is I'll just pause to get your reflection or some comments. And then because I want to get to where you are today, because you just recently, passed your bar exams and you're going into articling, and where do you see your career going, and some of the lessons you learned. So, so in this part, I'll just say you were a competitive figure skater, and I guess you coached as well as nice dance and qualification to the Canadian National Figure Skating Championships, selections to the Quebec figure skating team. Also, it really shows early discipline, high performance sports. Yeah, Canadian Figure Championships and so on. And you ended up being an undergraduate at McGill at the Bachelor of Commerce with honors in the Faculty of Management, concentration in human resources and labor relations, and minor in psychology. And so, really, this combination of honors, majors, concentrations, minors, again, academic excellence. And at the same time, you were also, and for many years, on the board of Million Peacemakers, and we'll go into some of that. And then you ended up a valedictorian of your graduating class. And as the audience knows, that your valedictorian means you excel. And the university you graduated from at that time, it's really considered, the premier university in law and things like that in the country, in Canada. And so it's a very prestigious one to go through. You got some pre-law professional experience, two internships at the Canadian National Railway within human resources, where you're working on things like labor relations, employee management, drafting grievance letters, union management disputes, large-scale recruitment work, and company-wide engagements, surveys. I mean, Canadian National Railways, 25,000 employees. You founded an intern wellness committee. So again, demonstrating kind of leadership. You did law school at McGill, dual degree in civil and common law, and just graduated back in December. And it's an integrated program spanning legal traditions. And so again, when you do a dual degree, again, more work and things like that. So student leadership doing law school, co-president of the McGill Business Law Association, leadership again, and then international public interest experience, Ministry of Justice at Namibia, customary law and human rights. So a very strong signal, comparative law and public interest exposure. And then, of course, for years, you've been in peace building. And I'll ask you some questions about experience. But peace building and board service with Million Peacemakers, which is now scaling to 250 million youth because of all of these recent MOUs signed between Million Peacemakers and the world's largest youth organizations. And this is again about leadership, advocacy, and community engagement. Within Million Peacemakers, the youth co-chair, co-creating the Global Youth Initiative, and repeatedly convening hundreds of young peacemakers worldwide and nationally traveling worldwide, representing Million Peacemakers in the different kinds of initiatives. So I'm going to stop there because I kind of profiled quite a bit. Do you want to reflect on some of that, what I've already profiled? Did I make any mistakes or did I miss anything there?
No, thank you. Yeah, it is great to reflect on that. And I think, I'm really grateful for all the people who gave me the time and opportunity to do all those diverse experiences. I was hearing you speak and I was like, yeah, that is. I was really lucky, to have kind of those student summers as well as some part-time work to be able to do all those different involvements. Maybe the one thing I'll add is, so it's been now this is actually my third summer that I've been working at David Ward's Phillips and Weinberg, which is a law firm, a big law firm in Montreal and in Toronto, a part of the Seven Sisters, and that's actually where I'll be doing my articling in January. So that's kind of where I'm at right now. As you said, graduated law school, did the bar exams, and in Quebec, you also have to do ça s'appelle la clinique juridique, which is basically kind of legal aid in itself. So I'll be doing that with bar in the fall, then articling as of January 2027. So if all goes well, I'll be a lawyer a bit more than a year from now. So that's kind of the future plans as of now.
So a lot in the audience, they don't really understand what it requires to be a lawyer. And in fact, I had an uncle who became quite a famous lawyer. And I know it's a lot of work. In other words, typically you have an undergrad degree, which you got with honors, and of course you were the valedictorian, which is like the top student, right? And then you went into law school, and you got this dual kind of sort of theme behind your law degree, and so typically lawyers have an undergrad degree, and then they have the specialization a degree in law, and then you wrote your bar exam and you have to article. So what is that process like, articling? And then once you finish articling and you're stamped, you could practice law. It's like you're certified, right? And there's regulatory bodies around law. Can you describe that process? Because the audience may not understand it.
Of course. Yeah, so basically in Canada, most of the province have common law, which is from the English like UK system through colonies before. But in Quebec, we kept with the French civil law. So in Quebec, we practice civil law, but at McGill, the school I went to, which is in Montreal, it's actually the only program in Canada that offers like a dual program where you learn both common law and civil law at the same time. So other schools do offer kind of the joint degrees, but you do it either like in the summers or it's a bit different. Whereas at McGill, it's a very much like integrated program. So you do graduate McGill law with both a common law and a civil law degree, which allows you to practice everywhere in Canada once you pass the bar exam. So contrarily to doing a degree that only has a civil law where you couldn't practice common law. So in other provinces in Canada, McGill allows you to do all the provinces in Canada as well as two jurisdictions in the US, New York and Boston, well, Massachusetts. So on that end, I decided to pursue the way of civil law. So I'm staying here in Montreal, and how it works is that you need to pass the Quebec bar exams. So there's 3 exams. You have the more like pure law exam, which spans family law, like contracts, torts, criminal law, hypothecs, everything basically. Almost you can see some of my books are standing there. You arrive at the exam with like I think about 11 books. It's open book. You're allowed to write in your books, but you're not allowed anything else than that. It's a 5-hour exam. Then a few weeks later, you have another exam, which is called Théorie de la cause and redaction. And that exam is more about if you're able to look at like proof, burdens of proofs, as well as like what type of recourse you could have in this situation. And there's also a big part of the exam that is writing like a demand to court. So you're basically writing that whole thing, and like it's then evaluated that way. Then a few other weeks pass and you have the ethics exam, which the ethics exam is honestly all jurisdictions usually have an ethics exam because it is a big part of being lawyers, keeping professional secret and confidentiality and all of the other duties that are born through the big responsibilities of being a lawyer. So you have those three exams. Once you pass that exam in Quebec, which is a new system actually since a few years ago, maybe like 4 years ago about, you also have to do a clinic. So this is a system where you're helping people. So it's this kind of like legal aid system that Quebec does for access to justice. And you are supervised by lawyers of the bar. And once you've passed all of that, then you can do your articling. So articling in Quebec is 6 months. So it's 6 months under a lawyer. And I'm very grateful to be doing it at a big law firm who was able to pay actually for my bar as well as like a stipend while I was doing my bar. So that is definitely something that removes a bit of the financial burden of going through all these studies. But yeah, so that's very specific to Quebec. In Ontario, it's a bit different where the bar exam, I think, is maybe 3 months of studying approximately. And then you have a few exams to do as well, but they don't have the equivalent of the clinic, but their articling is a year. So it's a bit different. And really great that Quebec and Ontario actually have some sort of equivalency. So once I'll be a practicing lawyer, I'll be able to get the Ontario equivalency if I wanted to be barred at Ontario, as long as I pay the fees to the Ontario bar, which is something I'm planning on doing since I also have the common law degree.
And so what I'm understanding then is that if you wanted to practice law in BC, then you'd have to register with the Legal Society in BC. And so it looks like it's provincially regulated.
Exactly. It is provincially regulated. I'm not exactly sure of the details of what if there's any sort of equivalency from Quebec to BC. So I might have to redo exams in that case if there's no equivalency. So it depends on all of that. Most jurisdictions do have a bar exam, and also once you get out of kind of like where my degree is registered. So the McGill degree allows you to pass the bar in Massachusetts, the state of New York, and all Canadian provinces. And also Quebec and France have this agreement. So that's also good. Like I could basically practice in France if I pass the ethics exam in France because of the civil law systems. But if not outside of that scope, it gets a bit more complicated. You might have to go back to school or do kind of other types of equivalency exams because law is so different from places to places and I do think it is one of those professions that they control access to it. So it is very jurisdiction dependent.
As an outsider, I always felt that law had this tremendous burden of memorization. In other words, you have to read a lot and remember a lot of detail. Is that the case, or has it changed? And when you're writing these long exams, like 5-hour exams, can you do it on a computer, or do you have to handwrite it?
So it's still by hand, at least in Quebec. So during COVID, they had actually changed it to be online, but you had, like a system that was monitoring that you weren't cheating. But they went back to the in-person format. So the first exam is multiple choice. So you like circling the circles within the paper. I remember I was really scared and like asking to re-erase because I was scared the Scantron wasn't gonna, collect my right answer on my sheet. And the other exams, like one of them is half multiple choice, half writing, and the other one is completely writing. I think I used 3 full liquid papers in one of my exams, and I was like freaking out with that. But yeah, it's still very much, like by paper. On the memory side, I do think that there is definitely a part of memory, but also there is more of a part of knowing where things are because it's impossible like to know all of this by like all of the subjects by heart. As I said, I think there was like 11 subjects on the first very much more law exam, and you're allowed all your books. So you kind of like, I had like a color system on my book. I think right now my book is actually at the law firm, so I don't have all of them with me, but I had like every 100 articles, I had a different color. So I knew, let's say I was like in torts, I know that would be about 1457, the article. So I would count to like 14, I've opened that page. And then also you kind of refer to other articles. So underneath a certain article, you're right, okay, reference back to X article. And then you go to that one and you write things down. So I think it's more about having the reflexes of knowing where to look and where to do different searches, whether it's within your books or whether it's within the different like legal databases that we have access to. And the other, I think, big advantage of, you know, like big law firms is for sure that we have a lot of people that work in knowledge management and have all these very up-to-date resources and can help us find things in ways that are way quicker than like the lawyers that are not in necessarily just research. So we're very, very grateful for those resources for sure.
Okay, so you do your articling, and then once you're finished and you're a lawyer, what titles do you have? Because it takes a while to become a partner, right? So what are the different kind of categories? It's like being a professor. People think that you get a PhD and you're a professor. No, you got to go through like you're a lecturer, then you're this and you're that and that. And if you're really fortunate and you do well, then you may get a full professorship. So what's the journey like in law?
Right. Yes, it is a good actually comparison. I've never thought about comparing it to getting tenure, but that is a good way to compare it. So hopefully after articling, the firm I'm with, Davies, like signs me as a lawyer. So basically after, I think it's about 5 months and a half of my 6 months, you get either a return offer or not, to stay with the law firm you are at. And once you are once you get that return offer, you are a first year associate, and it's basically by year of bar. So I'll be barred in 2027. Barred meaning I'll have passed all the bar exams, done my clinic, as well as done the 6 months of articling, and then I am a barred lawyer, is how we say it. So I'll be within the year of 2027. So my compensation and everything will be the same as every first year lawyer that was barred in the year of 2027. And I'll be a first year lawyer until January 2029, I think, because I'll be barred in 2027. Anyway, so you stay with that year of court, and then you become a second year lawyer, which that comes with a different second year associate. That's actually how we say like first year associate, second year associate, third year associate. And your compensation and everything varies based on the years of associates you are. The more it goes up, so I would say about, like fourth, fifth, sixth year, the expectations are starting to change. When you're a younger lawyer, the expectations are more that you're doing the work and that you're available. And the more it goes up, the more you're expected to start doing a bit more business development, which means like contacting a bit more clients, or at least like going to client lunches with the partners and like kind of swimming in that world a bit more. And depending on the law firms, some law firms will have like junior partnership, which is being a partner without equity. And then you'll have partner with equity. Other law firms do not have like the middle ground of partnership and will go directly to the partnership with equity. My law firm right now does have that distinction. So you can be an associate. After 6 years of being an associate, you can become a partner without equity. And after a few years of being a partner without equity, then you can be a partner with equity. So with equity, meaning that you have to invest like some of your own money within the firm. And now you basically have like units of the limited partnership that you're part. So you're actually very much part of the business. So that's also why it takes so much time, is that they're really investing a lot. Well, you are also investing in it, but the expectation is that usually when you're a partner, you don't really leave after that. Some people do, but it's very rare because you have to, remove your equity and leave, and it becomes a bit more complicated.
Yeah, so really, you're an owner, basically, of
Exactly.
equity. You're an owner in the partnership, and then even within that, there's like more senior partners. And I know when my uncle was with Davis and Company, and it became a really large law firm, and and they eventually became the head, like the first name on the list of partners on which is the most senior position, and then he actually left and founded another law firm, which became quite a famous law firms. So he had to pull his money out that the other partners would have to buy his equity, right?
Yeah. Exactly. So that's what I mean by it becomes more complicated once, but some people do it, and we've had, situations actually of, lawyers, leaving even if they are a partner, which, it's not like they're not tying you to the establishment. It just, I think once you're at that point, there is a bit more invested from both sides. So that's also why it takes a bit more time to get to that stage. And of course, the compensation model changes once you're at that point as well. And it also, once you're a partner, you are very much involved in who's getting hired within the firm because it is, part of your business. So the partners are very much involved, which I think maybe is a bit different than other business models. Is with a law firm, the partners that have equity are very much involved with who they're hiring as, students or as well as like young lawyers because it's, part of their business. So that's a bit different than when like you're a CEO of a big corporation. I don't think you really have that much visibility of who the interns or the new hires are. But within a law firm, it's very much, it's a bit of a smaller model as well. Like the law firm I'm at, we're 112 lawyers. So it changes a bit how the organizations recruit for sure.
Yeah, and again, just to reflect, and then we'll move on because I'm just so curious. My uncle used to say that maybe only 10%, maybe 20% could really make a living at it. And then you'll find lawyers as booksellers and they're teaching or they're in areas that are completely different than practicing alone. And it's because it becomes difficult do you think that's true? He was saying like 10, maybe 20% can actually be a lawyer and practice as a lawyer and the rest that go up in other fields.
Mhm. Well, I'm not exactly sure about the percentage, but it is true that it is a challenging career. And I also think that it opens, law is so diverse within the things that you study, but as well like the doors that it opens. And I think it also like the people it attracts are sometimes we like to say insecure overachievers. So it brings people that, want to do more. Sometimes they don't want to practice law, but they'll do something else that is also super incredible. So I do think it brings a very curious mind and people will do different things with that. And I also think that once you are though in, the big law practices, it's definitely a lot of, a lot of hours, a lot of commitment. It's not necessarily something, that everyone wants to do, but as I said, there are beautiful things that the law practice and the law studies can bring. So I think people kind of differ to different paths with that.
Okay, so we should just mention too that you did a secondment, a CDPQ within the ethics and compliance team, gaining exposure at the intersection of governance and ethics and business operations. This is increasingly important. And now I'm going to do some tech intersection. What is the impact then is artificial intelligence having in your field? And then, because you have this ethical background, the lawyers have to pass an ethics area. You did work at the at the intersection of governance and ethics and business operations with their secondment on ethics and compliance. Can you interweave that with tech and what does it mean and your sort of beliefs on this area?
Yeah. So I do think that I arrived kind of in the legal world at a point where it was changing. When I arrived the first summer, we had two, I think, like AI tools. One of them we're not using anymore and has been replaced. but we're still using those AI tools as well as most of the legal databases that we use for search purposes have integrated, their own AI as well. I do think, maybe this would be an overstep, but I think that most careers are now going to have dealing with the age of AI, and definitely technology, but that has been present for a while now. But it's changing definitely the way we work. In some ways, it's more efficient. But in other ways, there is definitely a lot of reviewing that needs to be done because as much as, the AI platforms that law firms are investing in are great. And also they are investing in, I think, contrarily, I think, to other businesses that a lot of businesses have been using Claude and been able to integrate that. A lot of law firms have been using more confidential platforms that are really based for lawyers. So I think of Harvey, which is a big one that a lot of law firms have been using. And it definitely has accelerated the speed at which things can be done. But like anything that is done with, AI, it needs to be a thorough review. So I think where it's changing is that some, depending on the lawyers you're working with, some will be more comfortable with it, some less. But you'll do tasks in a different way. So usually I'll work from a precedent, meaning that I'll work from, a document that has been done for another client or our client in the past with similar perspectives, let's say to a deal. And then I'll open a share purchase agreement or, the agreements that I need to use to fill in this precedent. And I'll work like that. But what's really good now is that with AI, I'm able to, afterwards give the precedent, give my work as to date and give the new agreement and be like, this is what I've done so far. Am I missing anything? And it's actually kind of going to help me do a review and it might need a bit less heads. Like I don't need to ask other students in the room, even though we do still, help each other out. But there is some sort of review and some sort of consultants that can be done through AI. Also, when you're a time crunch and you need to do a certain, let's say presentation, you can ask the help with AI. And obviously, I take the time to review it very thoroughly. But there are certain things that were maybe a bit more menial tasks that can be helped. And depending on the client's needs and desires, because some clients will be against AI, some clients will really want you to use AI, some other clients will be kind of in the middle. And we always, ask permission before using AI with clients, but you can do as well due diligence in a more efficient way. In some, like if you're looking for example for a change of control clause, so making sure that if X acquires Y, what would be triggered, what type of, control requirements and what types of consents need to be done. The use of AI can flag them a bit quicker. And then as well, like you'll go verify and make sure that you're not missing any and that the vocabulary is good. But there are things that can be accelerated. And I don't think the job is going to be eliminated, but I do think there'll be changes in the way things are done. And as young lawyers, we are being told by partners that we need to very much keep up to date and that it's going to be kind of our responsibility moving forward to be super comfortable with these tools. And, we're getting taught as well how to make kind of like assistants, which is kind of like the GPTs that are available on ChatGPT, but within our internal systems.
I see. So you are increasingly using AI, but definitely with human oversight, because you basically have to review all of the output it produces. The advantage, though, is it may bring up something, a particular area that you may not have considered, which then you are still overviewing, you're still reviewing it and saying, yeah, that's a good additional angle, perhaps, to what you're doing. So it can help in that kind of due diligence side, bring up things that needed also to be considered, basically speeding up the time, right? Because it can sort of survey everything. It can survey all the case law out there, right? Instantly, basically, and then say, have you considered this, Y, and Z? And then all of your past firm's work, it would have that in its database. So it would understand, well, this is similar to this precedent that occurred that was written by this attorney, and you can look at that work. And see how much you can integrate some of those learnings into the current case you're working on. Is that what you're saying?
Yes, I do think that that would be a potential, outlook. I think in my own ways of currently using it, I like to kind of scope it down a bit more. So I usually give it the documents that I was already comfortable working with. So the documents that I was personally already using as a precedent and the resources, if I'm working on a certain precedent, on a certain presentation for a specific decision, then I'll give it like the superior decision, the superior court decision, as well as the appeal decision. And I'll very much, I prefer to narrow it down a bit because then it also highlights the places where it used the precedents and the documents, and I can do the verification in a bit of an easier way. I personally don't use the aspect of it like searching online all that much because I'm a bit more worried still at this point, maybe with this hallucination. But I do think if you do a thorough verification, that could work. One of the issues I think we have currently in Canada is that a lot of like some of these AIs are trained on Canadian models, but as well, some of them are trained on US models. So we have to kind of, as I was saying earlier, a lot in law is jurisdiction based. So that's why there is, always something to be checked and to make sure that you're in the right jurisdiction. Because if the AI is citing this case of Pennsylvania, but we're in Quebec or we're in Toronto, like we can't be, citing that this law won't be binding. So that's a bit why I think we're encouraged to kind of like scope it down or research as to things that we're already comfortable working with as documents. But on the point that it can consider things that you haven't thought about, that is, something to look at is that you can say, like, I've done this, like, what do you think? If you're kind of like bogged down at a point where, you kind of have like either blank page syndrome and that you've already like done it all, but you want to make sure that you're not missing anything, or that you wrote your whole document, but you want to make sure you're not missing any dates. I think sometimes it could be a helpful check. Sometimes what it will do is that it'll be a bit of an overkill in the sense that it's going to give more than necessary. But I do think that afterwards doing that thorough review will be helpful. So I don't think we're at a point where the lawyer's job is going to be replaced because I do think there's so much detail to law and that also the words are so important. The specific words that, a before versus an until on a date can be really important within wording for some clients. So we're still at a point where a human oversight is necessary because that although AI is great, it has a tendency to kind of change the words because it guesses the next word that's going to be used. So that's why I think the lawyer job is still going to be here, but it's going to accelerate the way we work for sure.
And you mentioned a tool called Harvey. So that's one that is designed for the legal field then?
Yes. So and I don't know if they used it from Harvey Specter or from Suits. I don't know if you've watched that show, but it's the show about, big law, and the main lawyer is called Harvey Specter. I don't know if they based their AI tool based on that show. But the tool is called Harvey Legal, I believe. And it's trained on the latest, I believe, ChatGPT, on the latest GPT. And it also trained on like legal databases. And it could, it has a lot of functions. So one of the functions it has is the vault function, vault. So in the vault function, you can put like a lot of documents within it and it can review those documents. So from a due diligence perspective, that can be interesting. But then you also have just kind of more, I would say kind of when you're speaking to Claude or ChatGPT, more like in text-based, that you can ask it questions, whether sometimes it's like, oh, how do I say this word in French? Or how do I say this word in English? That could be super useful. Other times, as I was saying, it could be, here are like decisions and I want to make a PowerPoint presentation on this decision. I would want it to cover this, 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 and then I'll make you a PowerPoint based on the template that you provided it with. And then you can edit it either directly within the tool, or you can download it on your computer and make the edits. So it's also meant to be more confidential than other platforms.
I see. So
outside of your legal use and this sort of a closed system, right? Because it's confidential information and you want to make sure that there's kind of moats around, moat meaning it's protected and it's private to your law firm. Outside of that, do you play with some of the tools just out of curiosity, like OpenAI or Gemini from Google or Claude from Anthropic or I think earlier you may have even mentioned OpenClaw. I don't know if you played with OpenClaw or not.
So personally, I used to use like tools like for school. I think like for me, like AI kind of became more of a thing like my first year of law school, and a lot of my friends weren't using them, using the tools, and I, started like playing with it. I think it also helps that my husband like went to school in computer engineering, and he's now a quant. So I do think, I'm kind of a bit more in that world. So that definitely helps. I use ChatGPT a lot, like when it came to school, sometimes to either help with, summaries, or also sometimes when I was struggling with a sentence and I wanted rewording. So that was a tool that I was using. Claude wasn't all that big as much when I was in school, but I've, definitely heard about it and tried to use it. Alexia uses OpenClaw. My husband uses OpenClaw a lot for work and other purposes, just to play around with it. And another one that I've, I don't think has gotten that much hype, but I like a lot is NotebookLM. I thought that for school it was really useful because it was I felt the platform that was the more like academically accurate when you gave it the right resources. Because the way I use it is like, oh, like here is a doctrine on X, or here is a paper on X, and I want to write a paper about this subject, but I'm struggling with my thesis. And it was really, really helpful. And I really like when it shows you in the text where it found it from. And in Notebook, you can do that where it does like a little number, kind of a footnote, and it references exactly where it found it in the text. So from a risk perspective, like I prefer platforms that offer that as a tool, as a functionality. And also what I really, really liked about Notebook when I wanted to do my reviewing for exams is that you could give it information and it created podcast. So I would, I would make like these podcasts about my security law classes, and it was like a great way to kind of like re-review the material. Or even when sometimes I was bugging down for a paper, I would say I would want to write this paper with this thesis, and here's some sources. Can you try to make a podcast? And then it would really help me to kind of like digest the material in a different way.
That's really interesting. So what you're saying too is your husband is he studied computing engineering, right? So, and he's a quant meaning somebody who's applying, typically it's in high frequency trading or something like that. So, and you have to be really mindful of speed and the use of AI and things like that. And he sounds like he does play with OpenClaw, and because he's there, and there's always concerns about OpenClaw. So OpenClaw was this Peter Steinberger. He came out with it not that long ago in the fall of last year, and it became sort of the most used tool in GitHub and things like that. But it didn't have a lot of any security and stuff on it, so you had to be careful on how you used it, right? And so typically, if you're using it, you have to be a kind of an experienced person to protect yourself and to use it properly.
Yeah.
What's happened is that NVIDIA now has come up with their own version of it, where they put some security around it, guardrails, Microsoft, and now I'm reporting from what influencers are saying from the latest conference of Microsoft and stuff like that. But they've got a team looking at it and building sort of wrappers around it to make it safer and easier to use. So you don't have to worry about the security aspects. And of course, Peter, the creator of this thing, his tool was basically acquired by OpenAI, still open source though, and then he's been hired by that company. So I just want to get a bit of context. So have you actually tried it yourself, or you would get it to run agents just for other things?
No, I'll be completely honest. I haven't had time to play with Claude or Open Claude all that much with bar school and everything, but it is something. In some ways, I'm like scared to use it just because I'm like, like I know it's such a great tool, and like with like now from what I'm hearing, like financial firms, like where like my husband works, or as well, like what some members of, like distance family work, like they have like kind of like their own like confidential tools of cloud, of versions of cloud where they can use it. And, budgets are allocated per week per analyst and stuff like that. And it seems like it's kind of like another employee that they can have. So it seems very, very impressive. But in some ways, this is dumb, but I'm like almost scared. I'm like, as much as I was impressed and I see how it can change the way we work, there is definitely a bit of like, oh my God, like it's going so fast, but it's definitely cool. And I'll have to get to it.
Yeah, so Microsoft Build was last week, and if you look at some of the media around that, so I'm going to only report it from some of the influencers of media that covered it. There's indication that they're working on something called autopilot, so not just co-pilot, but something that automatically does things for you. So in other words, really an open cloud that's safe, right? With its safeguards around it. You see Anthropic came out with their AI, what they call dream capability, which means with an idle time, an agent can go off and look for patterns and look at past things it's done and find ways to improve. So this has elements of what's called recursive self-improvement. And recursive self-improvement means that these things are starting to be able to just improve themselves. But it leads to the point where they can improve themselves without any human intervention, just on their own and oversight. And so this became such a concern for even for Anthropic, who created this capability. They came out last week and said, hey, maybe we should do a pause, because these things now, it looks like they're going to have the ability to just go off on their own and improve themselves, right?
Right.
And it's a non-zero chance, in other words, right? It can happen. Also, you can launch these little sub-AIs, like Anthropic, Microsoft, all of them can do it. They're called agents. And then these agents can be orchestrated, so they work together to solve things. And then these agents can launch other sub-agents to do tasks. And now they've given them the capability where these master agents can actually drive the sub-agents based on outcomes. So in other words, a sub-agent could report back and say, this is what I've done. And the master agent said, no, that's not what I'm looking for. It would go back and redo it or think deeper. So it kind of works on its own, to the point where, and again, I recommend the audience go and research this directly. This is kind of my view of looking at the media reports. But Dario, the CEO of Anthropic, is alluding that you could have one person basically running an entire company with an AI, right? The AI just does everything, right?
Right.
And so they're giving AI the capability now where it can run assistants, and these assistants, they can work on their own, and then it's like having more people work for you, and you don't have to continually monitor them. You just give them some task, and then they go away and they just do it. And so, okay, so that's a big bucket of lots of ideas, but these ideas, because I'm a futurist, I predict where things are going, and I believe this will happen next year. You'll already see elements of this year, which means that you have a students articling, and they do all of sort of the I don't know how to call it, but some of the detailed task work of the partners and stuff, right? What'll happen is you could have an agents doing that. So that's where it's heading. So all of that junior, associate, articling student kind of work is just done by these AIs, and they can do it on their own, and they can go off for days and work on this thing, right? That's going to impact the legal field. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, and it is definitely something, that we reflected on. And I think that's why, like as a student and as a, like going into the legal profession, it's definitely important to keep an eye on that. And I think, again, like that's something that I'm very grateful that my firm, has invested a lot in that, and like in technology and AI, as well as training youth on those platforms and making sure that we know how to use them. On the point of, will it be kind of like that will have kind of like our AI assistants and that it will replace, the job. I'm not exactly right now from like what I see within the firms. I don't think we'll be quite at that, right now. And I don't know if that's necessarily going to be what's going to be up. And I think part of the reason, and this is, entirely my perspective, it might come, as well from how, the legal career as itself is something that, I think is very sometimes more risk adverse, as well as within, the regulatory bodies that we have. It also depends on how much they want to advance on that. And because even though, let's say, if we would pass like one of the assistants and ask them to do it, it's still the young lawyer's responsibility. So if or if another lawyer decides to use an assistant and uses like an assistant within an AI assistant to do the work, it's still their, bar responsibility. So if something goes wrong with the AI, it still falls on them and they can get disbarred, right? So I think on that perspective of that risk and that personal liability, I there might be a bit more of a reticence like towards that. But I do think that if we're in a system where it could be you ask a task, the AI assistant does it, you review, you ask a task, and that will definitely, I think, save time. I don't know if from a numbers perspective, it'll be reduced or whether the output that is expected from us is just going to, increase. Because if lawyers are able to do more work, maybe we'll just be able to get more clients, or we'll be able, to deliver things more quickly to clients, and the world is going to go quicker. Is it going to be on that end, or is it going to be the headcount that I'm not sure. I hope it won't be headcount, and then I hope we'll just be able to be more and more efficient. But I do think that, like lawyers everywhere will have to adapt to that reality. And especially I think the young lawyers, because we'll be the ones growing up within that world. Whereas I think, things that maybe have been done a certain way and now, are always going to be done a certain way as, might not necessarily change, but it's going to change for us. That's for sure. So we'll have to be really on the lookout.
Yeah, so that's where we get into some called artificial general intelligence, super intelligence. So in my opinion, it's going to definitely have a profound impact on you. So, and it's going to happen sooner than later. Okay, let's now move to, so we spend quite a bit of time sort of mapping the career arc of a lawyer, and you're a star, and that star will continue to follow, and others will follow you as this North Star, because you're just amazing. You're an outstanding individual. Let's now talk about peacemaking, a million peacemakers. And can you talk about that journey? And can you talk about some of the work you've done with Stephen Heck, because you traveled around at Nonflict Month, and you attended YPO, YNG conferences like in Barcelona, and international peacemaking event in Zimbabwe, and et cetera, et cetera. So you were the the co-founder of the youth program, and in fact, Million Peacemakers did a pivot to concentrate more on youth than they did before. So can you talk about all of that? And you got to try to wrap it in about 5 minutes.
I'll do that. Yeah. So it's. I like to say sometimes my frontal cortex kind of grew at the same time as my involvement with Million Peacemakers, because I've been involved with MP since I think I was 22. No, I'm 26. So, or maybe 21. I'm not exactly sure, but I started off, as you mentioned, as the youth co-chair. So initially, I think Million Peacemakers already wanted to kind of, go into the youth sphere. And Gianluca and myself had co-created the youth initiative. So we had built a group of about 100 peacemakers internationally. And we had built events like Nonflict Month, which we had about 20 events worldwide, some of them were in Zimbabwe. We also had some in the DRC. We had some in Montreal. We had some in Toronto. We had some in Spain and Portugal. So, and kind of like Nonflict, which is our conflict resolution method that Million Peacemaker teaches. We're having conferences all over the world. And I think that was like one of the biggest initiatives that the youth had co-created. Afterwards, yes, I did travel with Stephen to Barcelona for the YNG conference. And the next place I'll be traveling with Stephen and John is to Toronto this summer for the YMCA World Summit. So we're looking forward to that. My work with them, I think I've always been very, very grateful for you and for all the other members of the board, but they've really always treated me as an equal, which I mean means a lot. I'm still, young, and I was even younger before. But I think, my perspective was always treated as equally as anyone's else. And I felt comfortable giving my point of views and seeing how it advanced. We're kind of shifting now to a world of more partnerships for the past 2 years. So as we're partnered with the YMCA, we partnered with GA Worldwide, and a lot of different organizations that are permitting us, to increase the count of youth. So that's very great. And, we are also advancing, I think, a bit more on the world of tech and trying to get ourselves out there. I think the next goal for us personally would be to be a bit more present on social media. I think that's something that is way more difficult than we think. And I would love for us to advance there.
So let's kind of build a little bit of context. So what is Million Peacemakers? Can you talk about what Nonflict is? There is a Nonflict AI. Can you talk about that?
Yeah.
Can you talk about maybe what the goal of Million Peacemakers is, maybe in 2 years?
Yes. So Million Peacemakers is a nonprofit based on peacemaking, and we teach or we co-create with others the way of Nonflict, which is a 3-step conflict resolution process. So it's not, I would say, an easy process, because it's something that you really need to engage with and that you need to dive deep within yourself, your thoughts, as well as those of the person you are in a conflict with or the people that you're in a conflict with. However, the point of it being 3 steps and not too long is for individuals to be able to remember it and to refer to it and to not make it into something that is, non-understandable. So we were trying to create a way for peace in the world at the individual and then the group level. So if you have peace with yourself as well as the people around you, it'll be easier for, the world entirely to have peace. So it's to target specific people and then co-create basically a culture of peace. So instead of going to, a big problem and trying to untangle it all, the goal is for everyone to have the tools to be equipped to live a more peaceful way of life. So that's a bit about, I think, the Nonflict way, which is the way we teach for peacemaking. Its goal right now, we're very much focusing on youth. So as maybe a comparison to how the youth needs to learn AI to be able to still be relevant, I think, the youth has a lot in their hands, and we are at the point where we need to take responsibility and ownership. And also we are a big part of the population and the generation that is to come. So to target youth is to be able to make sure that the next generation are equipped. So that's, kind of the goal behind targeting the youth generation. I do also think that youth generation has a lot of grit and motivation, and that we are at a period, I do believe that Gen Z is quite active, quite vocal. So might as well use that for the good. And the goal, for 2 years is that we would like to get to, like, now the goal initially was 1 million, but we would love to have 1 billion peacemakers and, to keep moving forward. And, I think even now we're close to having, if we can get to, I think it's 2% of the population, we can get everyone, right? So we're really trying to move forward on that.
And really, this sort of pivot towards really focusing on youth really was driven by your work, right? Because you represented this first youth initiative, and you did things. You did global events, you convened programs, and it caused the board to think, you know what, we need to shift towards youth. And now the youth program has expanded considerably with these partnerships or MOU signed with some of the largest youth organizations and things like that, and it's really resonated. You mentioned doing a YPO-YNG conference. So just as a bit of context, YPO is the largest private CEO organization. It's about 38,000 CEOs. I would say about 12 trillion annual revenue across 150 countries. And YNGers are the YPO next generation. And those are the 18-year-olds and older of YPOers. And they themselves have their own community. And they have their own conferences and things like that. So if you've done joint events with them, and then of course, Africa has been a big center point for peacemaking as well. And that's why you've done these events in Africa. But you've been doing this and integrating this throughout. What do you think the goal then is for Million Peacemakers? What is Million Peacemakers going to look like in 2 years?
That's a great question. I think it's in some ways I have goals, but sometimes it's hard to imagine. I do think the world is changing, and if we think of where we were 2 years versus now with all our partnerships with some of the big six groups of youth, it's great what we're doing. I do think from a personal level of where I think that Million Peacemakers would be great for us to be in 2 years would be great, that those partnerships are very solid, and that we're kind of seeing a shared commitment, and that we're included in future events continuously, and that we kind of become a pillar of those youth organizations. And I do think the partnership route was a great way for us to have more visibility. And if the goal is really to equip people, that might, have been the best way to do so. I think kind of having a certain consistency and seeing always the same type of involvement and being always very present would be great. I think within, nonprofit organizations, sometimes a bit of the struggle is keeping a motivation that is consistent throughout members. So I think that would be amazing. I do think that another thing that we should be focusing on is really like the social media presence and making sure that we're targeting youth through those channels, because a lot of youth now are actually learning, through education influencers on TikTok or on YouTube. So I do think that's, a space that we would need to be on. And, if we're thinking long-term goal, if we could become one of those big six or now big seven youth organizations, that would be really, really great. But that's a bit more long-term.
And then for you, Thea, where do you see yourself in 6 years?
That's a great question. And I think that plan in my head, continuously changes. I think I'm trying to kind of adapt, and I'm very, very, very curious, which I think is good, but also sometimes can lead to different roads. If all goes well, I'll still, be a practicing lawyer, hopefully at the same firm. Obviously open, to things that come my way. Not necessarily closed on the idea of going back to school after a few years of practice. So we'll see. For me, it's kind of, I have maybe plan A, plan B, plan C. Currently, the plan A is, to be a practicing lawyer at Davies. And I do think that it's really important for me to stay involved and to stay, involved as a board member with Million Peacemakers. And I do run a lot. I signed up for my second half marathon. So by 6 years, I hope I'll have ran a marathon. I would love to do a full one and continue involving myself. I'm also, some of my runs that I'm doing are for charity. So I just did one for Jury Pup, which is a legal help, above legal aid, but to get access to justice in Quebec this weekend. And I'll be running a run for Fondation Mère avec Pouvoir in the fall, which is to help single mothers, step back up on sometimes some that have been victims of unfortunate things, and they have, great programs for them. So I'll be running to get funds for them in the fall. So those are kind of, the other things that I have in my mind.
So Thea, this is the very last question, and you got about a minute and a half to answer it. And the question is, what is your final recommendations to the audience, and
what questions do you want the audience to ponder?
My final recommendation, I think I'm going to say that a smile goes a long way. You know, things sometimes that we see in the streets or just people around us, we don't necessarily know what's going on in their minds. And although we do teach the Nonflict way, which is, you know, a great way to peacemaking, I also believe a smile can do a lot of peace in the world. So to keep an open mind and to smile to the people around you and, you know, to offer help if you can. But, you know, just a smile sometimes really changes the course of someone's day. When people smile at me in the street, sometimes it really helps me. So I try to do the same. For questions to think on, you know, ask why on various things. You know, if you're thinking a certain way and that you're bogged down in your ways, I think, you know, school really taught me to ask why, and McGill really unbugged a lot of things that were preconceived in my mind. So ask why to people around you, ask why to yourself. Sometimes conversations can get heated, maybe because we're not asking ourselves the why. So try to do that a bit more.
So Thea, that was just a really interesting and fascinating journey with you. And thank you for sharing so much of your wisdom and insights with our audience. And of course, the audience, I recommend they follow Thea online as well. And you talk about social media and follow your work with Million Peacemakers and your legal journey and your athletic journey and your volunteer journey and you know, just a marvelous North Star for the world today. So thank you again for coming in.
Thank you so much for taking the time.
Thank you for listening to the Brand Called You videocast and podcast, a platform that brings you knowledge, experience, and wisdom of hundreds of successful individuals from around the world. Do visit our website www.tbcy.in to watch and listen to the stories of many more individuals. You can also follow us on YouTube, Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. Just search for the Brand Called You.